First thing to do this evening is to introduce Dr. Robert Bewley, who's going to help us this evening in exploring this wonderful lady's adventure. Robert is a prehistorian, an aerial archaeologist, this is a flying visit, and a former director of the endangered archaeology in the Middle East at the University of Oxford. But most important, Robert is a good friend of the PEF, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Robert for the first part of the evening.
Thank you. I always know I'm in trouble when people call me Robert.
I do apologise, I missed a bit out. So
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh.
I have to say, obviously, we're missing somebody this evening, Felicity, and she's just undergone an operation. I think the news is that she might be home this afternoon. We're not quite sure, but I'm sure we all wish her the very, very best. Get back home here quickly, and we look forward to having her face around the place as always. Thank you.
Thank you. And leading on from that, it's all Felicity's fault we're here tonight, because some months ago, I can't remember exactly when, or was it a year ago, I gave a talk on aerial archaeology. What else did I give a talk on? And in the pizza place afterwards, Felicity said, Jane, you must do a talk on how you discovered the Middle East. So it's all Felicity's fault, so it's a real shame she's not here. But she did ask me if I would be Master of Ceremonies, and I have no idea why. But in a way, Jane doesn't need any introduction. She is very well known. But what I would like to say is she's an inspiration to all of us. If it hadn't been for Jane and her work in Jordan, high above Jordan, and there isn't a copy here, but there are many copies of books, please do buy them. I wouldn't have been able to do what I was doing in Jordan and have done for 25 years. And I think, Jane and you and I first met in the Mervenpick in Wadi Musa. It only recently opened. If you haven't been to the Mervenpick in Wadi Musa, I thoroughly recommend it. I'm not a one for great hotels, but they've designed it beautifully. And in fact, whenever I think of Jane, I think of her sitting in that wonderful Middle Eastern design, whatever you call it, square-roomed building. And it was really that from then our friendship began. But Jane is talented in everything she does, writer, author of many books. We were just counting up, it's 8 or 9, and there's another one coming out, but you'll see a list of them at the end. Photographer, archaeologist, am I allowed to call you an archaeologist?
No.
So, yes. Independent, but most importantly, she's great fun. I have memories of dinner parties, always on the night before we were about to go flying at 5:30 the next morning, being given far too much wine, sitting on that lovely balcony outside your house in Oman. But we did get up at 5:30 and do stuff. So tonight we're in for a treat, and a smorgasbord of anecdotes. And what Jane said she was going to do was a globe-trotting, name-dropping tour of the Middle East.
That was what I was told to do.
Oh, well, that's what you're going to do. And she's also going to explain her OBE, are you not? Jane, the floor is yours.
I went to a talk by Chris Patton at the Barnes Book Fest last year, and he started off by saying, now that I'm an OBE, and I thought, what is Lord Patton of Barnes boasting about being an OBE for? And then he said, that stands for over bloody 80. So I've used it ever since, I love it. This talk, as you can gather, is not going to be academic, so if you are disappointed in that, you can walk out now. But as Bob said, I was told that it should be globe-trotting and name-dropping. But as Jimmy Kimmel recently said, once he was back on air after that short intermission, I don't want to make this about me. And then he joked that that's what people always say when it's about themselves. At first it is all about me, for which I beg your indulgence, and I promise to improve. As a colonial child born in what was then Malaya, and evacuated in January 1942, a month before the Japanese invaded, to Tasmania, where we had this sort of rather odd family of 3 mothers, 3 sons and 3 daughters. And the 3 fathers were all prisoners of war of the Japanese. So that was very far from being anywhere near the Middle East. And after the war, we were back in Malaya, in this sort of tropical paradise, but it was very hot and very humid. And finally, on a farm in West Sussex, and I didn't come into touch with the Middle East or the Near East until I went to St Andrews University. And part of my medieval history course brought me face to face with the Byzantine Empire. And I saw that it reached right down to Arabia, over on the bottom right-hand side. And I thought, that is amazing. I had only seen Aden en route between England and Malaya, and the rest of the Middle East was a completely closed book for me. And my early working life was firmly rooted in Britain. My first job was lecturing to mainly schools on the dangers to health from smoking. You can't get further from the Middle East than that. I mean, it wouldn't be accepted in the Middle East. And these kids were absolutely fascinated with these pickled lungs with an enormous carcinoma in the middle of them. I next taught history at a school in Oxford, and then ran the publicity departments of 2 publishers in London successively. And while I was doing that, I moonlighted on interviewing writers and artists. There was Kenneth Clarke, Lord Clarke of Civilization, Cecil Day-Lewis, who was then the Poet Laureate, Iris Murdoch, Paul Gallico, who was amazing, and Lawrence van der Post. And they all had the effect of turning my mind outside London and Britain, especially Freya Stark, because I interviewed her when her book on Afghanistan came out, The Minaret of Jam, and she had travelled there pretty ruggedly just 2 years before, at the age of 75, and more of her later. But after several years of this life, I felt I needed a break from orthodoxy, and I cast around the world for somewhere to go for a year or 2, preferably where I could earn a living, and preferably where I already had friends. The ex-capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, now of course known as Istanbul, met every test. And on the way out to Istanbul, I stopped off in Italy for a few days to stay with Freya Stark again. And this time to do another interview with her, this time for The Guardian. And she told me that, this was in June 1971, she told me that in the September she was going to go to Turkey to brush up her Turkish at the age of 77. Pretty smart. And would I like to meet her there? Well, would I not? My time in Turkey was a bit like those 1970s Smirnoff advertisements, where life was transformed once you discovered Smirnoff. Mine wouldn't have been Smirnoff, but the Middle, or including the Near East. I did spend time with Freya Stark down at this wonderful place, Bodrum, ancient Halicarnassus, and went on various excursions with her. And I also met the most amazing American archaeologist called Iris Love. I don't know if any of you know of her, but she was a great character, a member of the Guggenheim family who had become tremendously famous by discovering a statue of Aphrodite at the Temple of Aphrodite at Cnidos, which was just the other side of the bay of Bodrum. And so when she finished her excavation that season, she came to Bodrum to start her journey out. And of course, heard that Freya Stark was there and gravitated towards her. But while I was there, that was how my completely new life, researching documentaries for television, began. First, of course, on that occasion with the BBC, and later with Granada and Yorkshire Television. But of course, as a freelance, you have a lot of vacant spaces between TV work. So when I was asked by a travel company if I would like to go to Jordan as tour manager for a group, I jumped. And of course, the star of every trip to Jordan is Petra. And in 1978, it was a very different place from what it is today. The Badul Bedouin was still living in caves, and I mean, some of the caves were actually tombs inside Petra itself. And this woman had just been doing some shopping in Wadi Musa village, and she had passed us in the Sikh with the panniers on her donkey absolutely stuffed with the provisions that she had bought in Wadi Musa. We, of course, didn't only go south, but to the east as well, and also to the north. This is ancient Gadara, or part of, now called Kais. And this photograph was taken a lot later, where a lot of restoration work had been done. The columns re-erected beside the main street. But it, and then also in Gadara, this again is a later photograph which shows the restoration that was done to the theatre. But in 1978, Taiki was seated in the front row of the West Theatre, and there she remained until some restoration work was done, and she was moved to new accommodation in a museum that was set up in one of the buildings in the Ottoman village that was right beside ancient Gadara. I was, I have to say, totally won over to the Arab world, but there were other temptations that came my way, and they came via Lawrence van der Post, who I had got to know him when I was working for his publisher, the Hogarth Press, and his book on the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki came out in 1970 on the 25th anniversary of the dropping of the bombs. And I had a very strong feeling for this book because my father had also been a prisoner of war of the Japanese, and we managed to get a lot of publicity for his book. I only had to pick up the phone, and people jumped down it and said, yes, we want Lawrence van der Post. Well, he asked me if I would like to go to South Africa and do some wilderness trails with the Wilderness Leadership School, of which he was a trustee. It was based in Natal, KwaZulu. And then, of course, not just do the trails, but write articles about it to get the Wilderness Leadership School a little bit more known. Well, would I not like to go? The Wilderness Leadership School was co-founded by these two men. On the right is Ian Player, the older brother of the golfer Gary Player, who was a lifelong conservationist, and Kumba Makubu Ntombela, a Zulu game guard for whom Ian had the greatest respect and affection. And in the time of deep apartheid, this white man was something very different. He wrote, "The land, the water, the air, and the animals don't give a damn about the color of a man's skin. Why should we? We all live in one world. As populations continue to rise, we demand more and more from this planet, and our problems become closer and closer. You don't have to be a genius to work that out." Well, on these wilderness trails that I went on, we were surrounded by artistic wildlife all around, and that was the Black Umfolozi River, which, as you can see, was shallow enough to wade across. The weather was perfect. What could possibly go wrong? Well, there were some wildlife, some branches of wildlife that seemed to think that human beings were good as snacks. But we had our insurance policy, Makubu, and I'm glad to say that his rifle wasn't ever called into use, so there were no human or animal murders. When this was all over, Ian Player asked me if I would like to record the Makubu's life story. And, well, I mean, would I not? So back in London, I managed to learn some Zulu, and I contacted South African friends about sources of funding, and then I later returned to South Africa to do the recording. He had some amazing stories, this old Zulu. He had been born around the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, and his first memory was of British soldiers wearing their red jackets, I mean, just so as to be able to be seen, it seems, streaming through the area where his family lived. And he was a small boy at that time. And they were in pursuit of the Zulu king, who was called Dinu Zulu, because they wanted to break Zulu power. And Makubu spent his whole life in wildlife conservation. Well, once those recordings were done, a British filmmaker I had met in Johannesburg, who had worked on films with Lawrence van der Post, said, "Why don't we make a film together?" And what better idea than to make a film about the San, the Bushman people of southern Africa, with Lawrence van der Post presenting it. So we wrote to him, and he very generously agreed. This is one of the many rock paintings that the San made in KwaZulu-Natal, because they once roamed over the whole of southern Africa. And now, of course, they are pretty well confined to the Kalahari Desert, and mostly in Botswana, though some in Namibia as well. And so off we went and made this film. And these are three of the hunters who actually set up a hunt for wildlife with one of the groups that we had filmed. And this is them bringing back their catch. And that's a gemsbok, or an African oryx. And you can see how dangerous those horns are. They very often were able to spear animals and sometimes even human beings. But it wasn't only about hunting. We filmed women digging for root vegetables out in the desert. When I say desert, the Kalahari is really a semi-desert. As you can see, there are bushes and a kind of grass that is growing there. We also filmed people making beads from ostrich egg shells and extracting water from a sip well. It didn't look as though there was any water to be had, and they would put a tube down and sip water out. It was incredible. But we also filmed some dancing. In this case, it was a healing trance dance to give healing to a member of their group who was not at all well. Notice the things that the dancers have around their ankles. And these are cocoons, some kind of bug cocoon, that are dried out, and then little chips of ostrich egg shells are put in, so that whenever they move, there was this wonderful rattling sound, which helped to induce this feeling that led them to trance. And the women took part. You can see one of the women sitting at the side of the fire, and they were clapping and singing to help induce the trance. But this was not the only reason for dancing. They loved dancing, and kids would be involved in the dancing as well, and it was for fun. This little character in the middle was one of the most extraordinary kids in any of the groups. He regarded himself as an adult, and he was always merry and joined in everything. He was absolutely enchanting. And then on the right, this young man used one of the roots that the women had dug out to carve a pretend camera and to imitate me going round and clicking away as I was for most of the time. He thoroughly enjoyed this mimicry. And here is Lawrence van der Post in one of the caves in the Drakensberg Mountains in Natal, which had been painted by the Bushmen with all kinds of antelopes and some cattle and this was when we were actually filming. And here is our full team with, you can see that the guy squatting in the striped shirt with the film camera in front of him, and that was Paul, who was the director and main cameraman, and his assistant cameraman, and there was a sound recordist, a translator, which is very important when you're dealing with people who don't speak your language. But before we leave the Kalahari, I wanted to show you this, because I found it quite extraordinary. It was taken after sunset, when the sun had sunk well below the horizon. And I was told that that blue above the horizon was the shadow of the earth against the sky. I've never seen it anywhere else, but that was something quite extraordinary. Despite these extraordinary experiences, the call of the Middle East remained strong. And by 1948, I had some wonderful Jordanian friends, and they suggested that I go back there in another gap between television work to photograph Jordan's spectacular landscapes and antiquities, including ones that we hadn't actually been to on the tour that I'd taken in 1978. And also, of course, I was able to photograph some details that there hadn't been time for. And this was an early Islamic hunting lodge and sort of mini palace in a desert area of Jordan. And it shows the constellations. In the middle, you can see a small bear, and that is Ursa Minor. And then there is Ursa Major and various other constellations that surrounded their universe. My friends had a great friend of theirs who was the Secretary General at the Ministry of Tourism. And one day when I was visiting in 1985, I naively asked him if it was possible to do some aerial photography, to hire a high-winged light airplane and photograph this stunning country from the air. Absolutely no chance, he said. It's all in the hands of the military. So I shrugged resignedly. And then he added, but if you would take some photographs for the ministry as well as for you, we might be able to arrange something. And the very next day, I got a phone call to ask me to come for a meeting with the head of the No. 7 helicopter squadron. And he had this huge map of Jordan on a wall of his office. And he stuck pins into every site that I had said I would like to photograph. And then when we'd finished, he stood back and he said, yes, well, I think we could manage this in 2 days. I nearly fainted, but there it was. The first day, the sky was absolutely leaden in Amman, and I asked the pilot if we shouldn't postpone until we had better weather. No, he said, the forecast for the south is very good. So off we flew, and our first stop was the Crusader Castle at Kerak, halfway down Jordan. And when we arrived there, the sky was still leaden, and we flew around the castle 2 or 3 times until suddenly the clouds parted and the sun fell right on the Crusader castle and on the town beneath it. It was long before the glacis had been restored, and you can see something of what the clouds had been like. And the skies remained clear over Petra and on other days. And I particularly enjoyed seeing these Bedouin who had put up a tent by these ancient rock huts just north of Petra, and the woman making a strip of tent cloth just to the right of the lower right of the cut rocks. So this was sort of real life as well as antiquities, and indeed there were other non-antiquities flying in the north, and saw these two, with my feet dangling out of the side of the helicopter, of course, and saw these 2 women taking their small flock of sheep back between these 2 beautiful olive groves. So that was completely irresistible. I also volunteered to take photographs for Save the Children of a new project that they were doing, a rug weaving project with a group of Bedouin who lived near Madaba, south of Amman, the Bani Hamida. And so there was a woman who had set up her loom in the open air because the weather was good. But their children were the most adorable creatures that you have ever seen. So when I went back in 1988, I had brought with me some page designs for a book of aerial photographs of Jordan. I have to tell you, there was not a single book at that stage that showed how beautiful Jordan was. And Rebecca Salti, who was the head of Save the Children in Jordan, said, why don't you come to our opening, our launch of the Bani Hamida project, because Queen Noor is coming and you can show them to her, and if you want King Hussein to do a foreword, you can ask her. So there am I, part of the team, of the Save the Children team, and I was able to have a few moments and show Queen Noor the page designs and ask if King Hussein ever did forewords for books. And she said, send me these and I'll ask him. And a week after I got back to London, an envelope plopped on my doormat, and in it was the foreword for this book of aerial photographs of Jordan, and that was what the book turned out to be. And it was published early in 1989. And I decided I would have to go and live in Jordan for a year to help push the book around, because the distributor didn't seem to stir off his seat very much. And I thought it would help, but in the end I actually stayed for 27 years. But of course we were coming up to the time, the 2nd of August 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Tourists vanished, taking income from many people who completely depended on tourism for their income, and of course High Above Jordan sales plummeted. Jordan was the only country which received people escaping from Kuwait. When they first came over the border and between the border and Ruwaishid, they would just set up their own sort of informal tents, and until they were able to be transferred to one of the camps that the Jordanians managed to get put up. I actually worked at one of them. It was called Mercy Camp, and it was set up by Save the Children, and the Jordan Anglican chaplaincy was also involved in it, and my job was to register the first comers, who were all Bangladeshis, some of them from the Air Force who'd been working in Kuwait. Later, in Amman, I was employed by the International Rescue Committee. I and my portable word processor, I don't think I would have had the job if I hadn't had a portable word processor. And they had a camp set up very near the airport, which was the last place where people who had actually been booked onto flights were able to go before they flew back to their home countries. And then in mid-January came the first Gulf War, ending on the last day of February. And on the 1st of April, appropriately enough, 1991, I went to Iraq to photograph for UNICEF, Save the Children, Catholic Relief Services, and any other agency that wanted photographs to show what the people of Iraq were suffering as a result of the war, and in particular as a result of the sanctions that had been imposed. This shows something of the damage that was done. A telecommunications center in Baghdad and a water storage tank in Basra. Wings of hospitals were bombed and water treatment plants. Nobody seemed to be paying very much attention to the Fourth Geneva Conventions. But the worst of it was the effect on children. And this was a 2.5-year-old boy with severe marasmus, which is everything deficiency, not just vitamins, not just protein, but everything deficiency. And he weighed way less than half what he should have weighed. And of course, because water treatment plants had been bombed, there was very little potable water, and a lot of children got diarrhea and dehydration, and I don't know what happened to any of those. And this little girl had diabetes, but because of the sanctions, insulin couldn't be brought in, and I don't know what happened to her either. But there were some children who seemed happy and healthy. These little boys on the backs of buffaloes, very near Babylon, in a branch of the Euphrates. And the girl with rather burnt bread taking it home for the family. I went twice, in fact, to Iraq, a month after the war had finished, and then a year after the war began, in January to February, and I spent 5 weeks there on each occasion. But once back in Jordan, in my spare moments, I got on with my next Jordan book, which was about Petra. And of course, the one benefit for me was that there were no tourists there, only local people, and the Bedouin were only too happy to help. Some of the best bits was going to outlying places with Bedouin friends, and it felt like the most wonderful kind of freedom. And of course, Bedouin always have their tea kettle and industrial quantities of tea and sugar to make Bedouin whiskey as we went along. There was a flash flood on one day that I was taking someone from the International Rescue Committee down to Petra. You can see how churned up the ground in front of the treasury is, and that young Bedouin guy riding his horse through what had become a lake in the bottom of the theatre in Petra. And then in 1993, I was able to do some more aerial photography of Petra in particular. And the book was published later that year. And what my work on Petra made me realize was that apart from academics who knew about the Nabateans, the creators of Petra were not known very widely, and there didn't seem to be anything written for the general reader that told about this truly remarkable people. And so the idea for my next book was born at that moment. And but there were other places that the Nabateans had been to and had transformed that I wanted to see. And one of them was in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Hegra, otherwise known as Madain Saleh. But of course, Saudi was a bit difficult unless you had a father, a husband, or a brother who was available to go with you. And I had none. Well, I had a brother, but he was too busy to come, much as he would have loved to. So a wonderful diplomat friend who was the number 2 at the British Embassy organized a trip and with senior diplomats, and I could be shunted in as the cousin, which of course was not an appropriate relationship at all, but nobody took any notice, and I got there. And there I am in what looks a bit like a painting, but was actually a photograph. And there I am photographing inside Hegra. And this is one of the photographs that I took. We camped nearby, and we were able to go in every day and photograph wherever we wanted. And there were no restrictions at all. But of course, the Nabateans were closely involved with the incense trade, and so I wanted to go to the source of the incense, which was down in the south, and the Nabateans had ranged from southern Arabia right up to the Mediterranean. And this is the kind of, this was where the best kind of frankincense grew, this particular Boswellia, the Boswellia sacra, and so right, Yemen, here I'm coming. And I went with a good friend called Isabel Rubin, who's sitting in the front row, who had lived in Jordan for many years, and was a great companion on this trip. and her Arabic was so much better than mine. And I mean, to have an archaeologist and a better Arabist, you can't wish for better. My main focus was the incense road, and this was where Cana was, where the incense was brought in by boat and then started its overland journey to the Mediterranean. During that time, the great bonus that we had was Muhammad, who was lent to us together with the 4x4 vehicle that he drove by a travel company in Sana'a. And he was a great fan of Egyptian soap operas, and from time to time he would croon, "Alhamdulillah, what am I to do?" which apparently came straight from an Egyptian soap. Well, at Cana, down there on the coast, there was a French team that was working there, and the person leading it was Michel Mouton, who we had both met, and he was extremely helpful and nice to us. And then we followed the route. Well, we didn't, but we came at it in different ways. But the route that the caravans went first to Shabwa, then Timna, Marib, and the capital of the kingdom of Hadramaut. And I don't know where those 60 temples that Pliny said were built within that sort of fairly small area enclosed by hills. But that's what he said. But then Timna, which was the capital of Kataban, he said there were 65, and goodness said that's the temple of Aftar, who was associated with the planet and the goddess Venus. It was also the area, Kataban was the place where a lot of myrrh was grown, and so it would join the caravans as they headed north. And then, of course, there was the Marib Dam. That's the southern sluice, and here you can see part of the ancient dam wall, which apparently collapsed at the time that the Prophet Muhammad was born. And this is the north sluice on the other side. It was Sabah, which Marib was the capital, was the most powerful of all the South Arabian kingdoms. Well, of course, we spent quite a lot of time in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, where we stayed at the top of an old building that had been turned into a hotel, and we had amazing views over the whole of the old city, with their wonderful decorations, and of course we also haunted the souk quite considerably. And we met this extraordinary man, charming, humorous guy, who was both a descendant of the Prophet and a judge. And he agreed to show us the various different outfits that he had to wear, whether he was being a descendant of the Prophet or a judge or whatever. And so his different daggers, jambiyas, and the shawl that he wore, and the headdress that he wore. And while he was talking to us, he told us that his father had worked for the last Imam of Yemen, but had sadly drowned in a well in the palace garden. That very evening, I was reading Freya Stark's book, Dust in the Lion's Paw, which was her account of her World War II posting in Aden, and her visit to Sana'a to show films and win over the women of the palace, and to the Allied cause, and for them, of course, to influence the men. And what I read in her book: "Our poor telegraph man yesterday fell and drowned himself in a well. He was a friendly, mild creature, and it always gives one an unpleasant shock when the safety of the world is brought home to one." So that was this man's father. It was, I mean, just one of the most extraordinary things, that we'd met him and that I read that book at that moment. But Yemen was not the only place that Isabel and I travelled to. In 2009, we went to Egypt, first of all to Alexandria, and visited the sites, including the so-called Pompey's Pillar. Well, Pompey was 1st century BC, and the man this was built for, the Emperor Diocletian, was 3rd to 4th century AD. So why it was named after Pompey, goodness only knows. But our main goal was to go to Siwa in the Western Desert, which was an oasis, and it was a place that Alexander the Great had gone to because he wanted to consult the oracle of Amun, and that is the temple of the oracle in the middle of that oasis. And because he wanted confirmation that he was indeed descended from the gods. And the oracle very kindly told him that he was certainly a son of Zeus. And he wanted to be buried in Siwa, but his friends, when they took him from Babylon where he died, and they got as far as Alexandria, and they just couldn't go any further, and they buried him in Alexandria, but his tomb has never been found. So that's it. So after a few days in Siwa, we went via Cairo to the Eastern Desert, where we visited these two amazing monasteries, St. Paul's, and this is the monastery of St. Anthony the Great, who was born in AD 251. And at St. Anthony's, we were given lunch, thanks to a friend of mine in Cairo, by one of the monks, who also showed us round. And Father Maximus was, I mean, it was such a privilege to be taken around by him. He was an extraordinary scholar, something of a Renaissance man, and he had degrees in art, music, restoration, and agriculture. We couldn't have had either a more charming or more learned guide to the monastery. And he was also involved in the restoration of the paintings. This shows Christ in a mandorla with Mary up there and John the Baptist on the other side. And this is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John on either side of him, and of course supported by angels.
Sorry, why the animals?
Well, St. Mark was always associated with a lion, and Luke with a bull, and John with a hawk. The only one who had a human face was it wasn't all we saw in Egypt, but it was something very special. And the next year, in 2010, we went in June to Syria. And we went up to Khalad Saman, where Simeon Stylites, whose dates were 390 to 459, practiced extreme asceticism. He wasn't really suited to normal monastic life, and he tried to become a hermit, but his reputation meant that lots of people came to visit him, and so he decided to put up a pillar. And you can see him sitting on his pillar, where he stayed for 37 years. The church was built fairly soon after he died. He died in 459, and it was consecrated in 475. Now, of course, it has been severely damaged by Islamic State. And so too is Palmyra, Tadmor, which was founded in the 3rd millennium BC, and of course was famous for Queen Zenobia in the 3rd century AD. And we went further east to the Euphrates and to Dura Europos, which had been founded around 300 BC by Seleucus I, a successor of Alexander the Great. But in the Roman period, in 257 AD, it was besieged by the Persian Shapur I, and the whole population was deported. But between 2011 and 2014, more terminal damage was done by Islamic State. In the meantime, a country that had opened up rather than closed down was the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And of special interest to me was Hegra, Madain Saleh, and of course Dadan, an earlier site near Al-Ula, which is the main modern town of the area in the northwest Hejaz. And I had visited twice while I had been living in Jordan, but this time I went again on 2 occasions, because in 2019 I was asked to do a book about the area. Now, the Nabateans had developed this site, which had been a settlement of 2 previous kingdoms, the Dadanite and Lycianite kingdoms, just a little bit further south. And they developed it in the 1st century BC as a control point on the incense road. But an earlier control point on the incense road was Dadan, and some of its remains date back to the 3rd millennium BC, and it was mentioned in the Bible by various 1st millennium BC prophets, including Ezekiel, who said that Dadan had supplied Tyre on the Mediterranean coast with saddle cloths for riding. So this was the center of operations of the Dadanite kingdom, and then later the Lycianites. But further along towards on the rock face, getting nearer to you, as it were, there was another group of people who were also very much involved in the incense road, the people of Maine, the Manaeans, and they had their own burial ground just up the road from Dadan, and obviously the two peoples got on extremely well, and their burial sites were guarded by their own gods. The Minaian gods. They also adopted some of the local gods, just to be polite, I think. But my favourite place is absolutely Hegra, I suppose, because of the Nabateans. And while I was there in the autumn of 2023, a great Jordanian friend, a photographer, Bashar Taba, came out to teach me how to do nighttime photography. And this is one that sort of more or less worked. And now I'm bidding you farewell with a sunset picture, also from Hegra, and these amazing pinnacles of rock which hid the sanctuary, the main sanctuary of the Nabateans. And that is what brings to an end this talk, except that I'm going to show you some of my books. A few of them are available here. And if you're interested in buying them, I want to tell you that the money will go to help some Syrian friends of mine. The husband is a childhood polio victim, and his asthmatic wife and 17-year-old son, who are in dire situation in Tallahassee, Florida. So if you're interested in buying the books, it would be great, but there's no pressure.
Thank you, Jane. Inspirational, as I said earlier on. Now, you can't escape yet because there's question and answer session.
Oh.
I have been told that you are all invited to the Christmas party, but that was just fantastic. Thank you very much, Jane. You got the globetrotting, you got the name-dropping, kings, lords, everybody else, but more than that, you got a moving testament to what actually makes Jane tick, which is helping people understand not only the past, but also the present. So, questions? Any questions for Jane?
Yeah. I thought it was a wonderful, wonderful talk. It sounds like a very delightful career that you've had, and everywhere you go, you've had lots of helpful people, not exactly smoothing your path, but making it good for you. But I just wonder, when you go to places like Basra, in the wake of bombing water facilities and hospitals by British forces, what kind does this affect the kind of relationship, the kind of reception you find from ordinary people in these places?
Well, I had enough Arabic to explain to them that I wanted to show the rest of the world what Iraqis were going through, and so people were very open to being photographed, because they wanted their situation to be known. Yeah, but I do find Arabs incredibly generous and helpful, and I've never had a single problem. I felt safer driving around the Bundu in Jordan by myself than I have in many places in Britain.
Thank you.
Louise?
Jane, that was wonderful. I've known you a long time, but I didn't know many of these things about you. So it was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. I don't think I missed it, but did you formally train in photography?
No.
Or I was really interested in how you've become such a wonderful photographer. Was it just you picked it up, or did you train?
No, my father was a wonderful photographer, and he gave me quite a few tips, but I think I probably learnt the most when I was in Turkey and was picked up by the BBC, and we had 3 months filming all around Turkey, and the cameraman was incredibly kind and helpful, and sort of gave me lots of advice about framing pictures and so on. I had just been given by a friend of the family a beautiful Leica camera, so I did have some advantages.
One of the things I was going to say was just how modest Jane is. And I know a little bit about the story of this air photograph and the planning that went into it. And I must have seen hundreds, if not more, aerial photographs. And I think to this day that is the best aerial photograph of an archaeological site you will ever see. In fact, the pilot, Khaled, is 60 on Tuesday, and I'm going to have lunch with him on Saturday. Because I remember ringing him. He said, "I'm just in a helicopter with Jane. We're just going to do Macaris." And I think it was when you took that photograph.
That was about 6 o'clock in the morning.
Exactly, yeah. But you knew, didn't you, that the light would be perfect at about 7.
But also that it would give that tail
Exactly.
to
Where the Roman siege camps are there
yes.
to try and beat whoever they were beating at the time. But that's another story. And Jane was very modest about not being called an archaeologist, but you got a sense of the depth of knowledge of history and archaeology. So I have no hesitation in saying she's an archaeologist. Any other questions? Oh, one more question. He wants his wine. Father Christmas wants his wine. Go on.
It's a simple question, and I'm sorry I missed the beginning of the talk because it's fascinating. You know, when you first showed the Nabatean site in Jordan,
Petra, yes.
Petra, yeah, it looked like there were buildings, and then behind them there was a kind of a whole landscape, which I initially thought it was kind of almost writing all over the rocks. And then I thought, no, it's just the natural kind of look of the rocks. But then you showed us the site in Saudi Arabia, and it also had the same look. So it's not writing that's on the rocks, because they've known
there is, but they're carved. These are Nabatean tombs that are carved into the rock faces, and with all the decorative features that they had. Most of the tombs in Hegra in Saudi Arabia do have inscriptions. There's only one tomb in Petra that has an inscription, and it's much longer than any of the others, and it's huge, but very sophisticatedly done, whereas the ones in Hegra weren't. But it is just the carving into the rock face and the rosettes and of course in Hegra they've got faces of weird creatures and
it's just that in the photograph it looks almost like the writing is everywhere, and I just wasn't sure.
Well,
because
I think they weren't. It wasn't writing, but
yeah.
But I've often wondered, and I know we're not allowed to ask another question, but one final question, which is I often think, because I've been lucky enough to go to Hegra and Petra, it's almost as if the Nabateans are not copying, but developing what nature has done. I don't know whether you get that same sense, that you can see that the sandstone and the limestone is eroding, and then they're doing what we do, which is copy nature. And
So
that's part of what
they're kind of patterning,
and they're carrying on that pattern. That's what I've always thought.
Yeah, okay.
well, if you look in my Petra and the Lost Kingdom of the Nabateans, you'll see some of the styles, mainly Petra, but also Hegra and other.
There you are. So you cannot leave without buying the book. I'm getting signals that the Christmas party is about to start, so we should.
Yeah,
but
I don't want to keep you from
you can't keep
wine.
you from. I don't know what's happening, but anyway. But two people to thank: Felicity for having the idea that Jane would give a fantastic talk, and what a shame Felicity's not here. But also for Jane for agreeing to do it, because it took a long time to twist her arm, because she is modest and she doesn't like giving talks. So we are actually very honoured and very privileged to have heard what is a fantastic lifetime story didn't know any of the early history in Malaya and all that, and you know, and I remember the films of the Bushmen, the Kalahari. That was really fantastic. So thank you again for not only telling us about the past, but also your interpretation of the present as well. So a final thank you to Jane.